Good morning. I'm Jennifer Davis, a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment's Technology and International Affairs program. In my normal life, I'm a U.S. diplomat, and for decades in my career, I've seen both the exciting opportunities and the pressing challenges that technological advancements of the past few decades have brought us. So it's a great pleasure to join you this morning for Carnegie India's 6th Annual Global Technology Summit's panel on cloud and sustainability, transitioning to a greener future. We are very honored to be joined today by Ken Haig, Rajkumar Bhuya, and Ariel Levite, and we will begin with opening remarks from each of you shortly. But before we do, let me open just first by noting that with the advent of the internet, for many decades, companies and governments could only benefit from computing power by accepting the expense and the burden of maintaining and defending their own sometimes vulnerable IT systems. And as IT spending ballooned and threats to private data and systems increased, users have increasingly turned to third-party companies to provide their IT services. The most flexible and dominant arrangements allow cloud service providers to provide customers with cloud computing, which enables the outsourcing of their IT services that would otherwise occur on users' premises. Under these cloud arrangements, users rely, of course, on the cloud service providers, who are companies that operate vast networks of servers and associated data centers around the world, to offer secure, affordable, and powerful IT services over the internet. And examples of such cloud service providers are Amazon Web Services, where Ken is, Microsoft Azure, Global Cloud, Alibaba, and of course, Tencent. Cloud service customers can send and transfer data, access and store files, and use computer applications without having to shoulder the cost and responsibilities of managing their own IT systems. And even governments are turning to the cloud for activities that range from data storage to delivery of social service benefits. Individuals too have, even if they're not aware of it, been using the cloud for entertainment and education via social media and video games and online streaming. To date, the cloud has been an efficient, comparatively accessible, and mostly secure innovation. It is a demonstrated accelerator of business growth, and so consequently, it could continue to drive economic growth into the future. But alongside the many benefits of the cloud has raised vexing and interrelated challenges, and we'll talk about those today. And if left unattended, these challenges can undermine the economic and social gains of cloud adoption. We must be concerned about the concentration of so much data and computing power in the hands of relatively few actors. And service disruptions, of course, can cause severe consequences. And cloud computing also raises important human rights issues about consumers' right to privacy and the prevention of government's use of cloud data for surveillance or other malign activities. But our main focus today will be about the environmental impacts of cloud computing. And we know with the exponential growth of data centers for the cloud, power consumption and water usage for cooling has increased significantly. And due to the resulting environmental impact of these increases and the emerging concerns about e-waste and recycling of obsolete computer technology, we've seen cloud service providers really focus on how they can have green policies for their data centers. And for these reasons, we know that businesses are thinking a lot about how not only to protect data, but how to protect our planet. So we'll look forward to talking about all of these very challenging issues and the balance of how we can maximize all the potential of the cloud while minimizing many of the potential harms. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to the real experts. And I'm going to start with you, Ken. Can you tell us a little bit more about Amazon Web Services and your thoughts on some of the issues I raised?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Really appreciate the chance to speak here. My name is Ken Haig. I'm on the public policy team for Amazon Web Services, which is the cloud computing part of Amazon. I sit in Japan currently, but I cover all of the Asia Pacific region, including South Asia and Indian markets as well. And one of the roles that I play is to try and help unblock regulatory hurdles, policy hurdles to meeting our climate pledge goals, as well as our renewable energy goals. And so just by way of introduction, let me talk a little bit about what we're doing on both of those fronts. So in 2019, Amazon co-founded the Climate Pledge, which is a goal to reach the Paris Agreement targets of net zero carbon, but a full 10 years early. So we've signed on in 2019. We've been privileged to have over 200 other companies join us since in pledging to meet net zero carbon by 2040, with quite rigorous pledges in between to be, first of all, decarbonizing where possible first, regular reporting and transparent accounting of progress towards those goals, as well as looking at carbon offsets as a last mile solution, and making sure that these are real, permanent, socially responsible, and nature-based solutions where possible. So that's a pledge that we've made and that we're working towards. As Amazon, we are looking at our Scope 2 emissions as one of our first priorities. And so for that, I can talk more about how we're promoting energy efficiency first, because the cleanest energy is that which we don't have to use in the first place. So we're always focused on maximizing efficiency where we can. But we've also said that for the remainder of our energy use, that we'll meet 100% renewable energy for that use. When I joined Amazon a little over a year ago, the goal was to meet this 100% renewable energy goal by 2030. We've since moved that up. We're on a path to meet the 100% renewable energy goal by 2025. For the last 2 years running, Amazon has been the largest corporate consumer and purchaser of renewable power around the world. And we're just getting started. We're looking forward to enabling further renewable projects in every market in which we work. And working with partners to make sure that we are making renewable energy more affordable and more available in all of the markets in which we work. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to talk more about specific programs as a part of the discussion itself. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. And Professor Raj, can you tell us a little bit about your work at the University of Melbourne?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer, for opportunity to be part of this panel. At University of Melbourne, I am responsible for directing Cloud Computing and Distributed System Laboratory. So where we conduct research on various aspects of cloud computing, especially in terms of application development systems and also application deployment systems. So when it comes to application deployment, that is where this energy efficiency or sustainability of clouds come into picture, where how not only use renewable energy, but also how do we reduce the energy consumption, so that way we can make this cloud data center more and more sustainable. Then of course, as a research laboratory, so we have many researchers who are pursuing their PhD, then of course postdoctoral research, some more of academic research. And apart from that, 10 years ago, I have spin off a company called Moderator. So this is a company that commercializes the research or IP that we created in Cloud Lab into commercial world. So that company called Moderator. So Moderator is a technology company that has a product called Aneka, is a cloud application platform. So this platform can be used for creating applications rapidly. And once you create, you can deploy on a private enterprise cloud or a public cloud like Amazon or Azure, Amazon, what Ken just mentioned. So this software system is quite prominently used all over the world, especially in China and India in particular. So lots of universities in India, for example, use it for setting up a private cloud lab and teaching skills in cloud computing, application programming skills in cloud computing. And also they use it for research. For example, someone doing a research on, say, AI, artificial intelligence or data mining, they use it for that purpose. Then, of course, institute like Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO in India. So they use it for started image processing application. They'll set up a private cloud data center inside their organization, and then they use it for analyzing the data. So this is how, this is primarily my expertise. And of course, I also write books. I have written a few books. One of them is called Mastering Cloud Computing. So there is a textbook all over the world, because it has got a American edition. And then it also has Indian edition in India at affordable price, like 400 rupees. That is $9. For America, $90. And the same book is also in Chinese language, Mandarin, and that is for $3. So that way it is affordable. So the approach is sustainability of knowledge and digital asset, but also the solutions. So I look into all these aspects. That's in brief. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ellie. Before I do, let me just say the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, through Ellie and his team, have just been working on an extraordinary website on the cloud. It's very comprehensive, and it looks at all of the many challenges. It's going to go live in January, and it's going to be an extraordinary resource. So I commend it to all of you in January. And without further ado, Ellie, tell us some of your thoughts on the cloud.
Thank you, and good morning to you all. A great opportunity and wonderful colleagues to do it with. I think that if we focus specifically on the issues of sustainability that has been the primary interest today, we can discuss the role and the impact of the cloud revolution on water usage, electricity usage, e-waste and its recycling, laying of fiber optics cables to power the communications to the cloud and from the cloud, and so on, as well as the knowledge base that has been generated by the major providers of cloud services and so on, and the capacity to leverage it for purposes of dealing with climate change and other environmental challenges. I think you've heard here from some of my colleagues on the panel about some work that has been done at their initiative, or at least with their participation and so on. I think that more broadly, what we should lay out for ourselves are some standards and criteria to evaluate the progress we're making. Because as I think was already implied in Ken's comments in particular, we have to move up the requirements. And we have to move up the requirements because we're falling behind, both in terms of the deterioration of the climate challenges, but also because the exponential growth of the cloud services phenomenon, the digital transformation more broadly, means that we need to try and do a hell of a lot better than we've done to date. So we need to welcome what has been done thus far, but I think there are two directions to go. The first is the goals that corporations set for themselves. I think you've heard some samples of those type of things already. I think the second one, and how do we upgrade them? The second one is how those are being then expanded, as was already implied, for example, in the comments of SAP, for the entire supply chain, for the customers, and so on. The third is how the market size of particularly the hyperscalers is then leveraged to change the market direction. Again, we've heard one example of that nature already from my colleagues, and I think this is a much bigger issue. Finally, we have to think about transparency measures and anchoring in real standards. So we shouldn't settle just for the standards these players set for themselves. We clearly need to have objective standards that everyone complies with, and transparency around meeting them. I think there's been some progress in that direction, but I think we need to go a hell of a lot further. But finally, the issue in front of us requires that we look at the sustainability and inclusion issues in a broader context of the whole governance challenges presented by the ascendancy of the cloud and cloud services. Whereas you've said in your opening remarks, Jennifer, the benefits are real and significant. The risks and the costs are also becoming increasingly apparent. Whether those are because of inefficient use of the cloud and the costs associated with this, because of the market power that the hyperscalers in particular leverage versus the customers, and so on. And clearly some of the pushback against government's effort to try and regulate that space. So what we pitch for is to leverage this remarkable cloud resources and wisdom of the cloud providers to be the champions across the board, from robustness and resiliency to inclusion, sustainability, customer protection, human rights, and civil rights. Thank you.
Ellie, if I may, I'm going to stay with you for a few moments. I'm struck by the extent to which you're mentioning essentially self-regulation by the cloud service providers. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges of government regulation in this area and why self-regulation to some extent is desirable? And then you mentioned the market size and the hyperscalers. Can you talk about any government regulation in terms of monopolies or the size and scale of the service providers and the extent to which competition in this area would be helpful to some of the challenges presented?
So we have at least 4 major challenges if we actually try to go the regulation route. From the lobbying power of the hyperscalers, that makes it very difficult to formulate policies. There's profound disagreement between governmental agencies is a second issue. The interdependence of the issues is a third thing. And the potential for fragmentation of the global digital space being a fourth issue. So anyone who pins hope on regulation being the panacea for dealing with these entities and with these challenges, I think is likely to be disillusioned. It's very difficult for governments to produce coherent policy. It's very difficult for them to promote it subsequently and anchor it in regulation and legislation. And it's even more difficult to try and coordinate this with other countries and so on. As a result, we shouldn't look for this other than as an incentive for self-regulation and industry-based standards, and perhaps the formulation of these standards in bodies like the OECD for the more developing and like-minded nations. So therefore, I think that the kind of initiatives that we've heard from some of my colleagues here are absolutely important. What needs to be done, taking us forward, is to try and anchor those in objective standards, in monitoring arrangements, in significant incentives to make sure that those that pledge to meet those obligations indeed meet them, and for others that fail to meet those standards, it's not only become clear, but that some disincentives are being applied, and so on. And finally, the expansion of the scope of that outreach to everyone, not just in the value chain, but also leveraging the size of those entities and their sophistication and resources to actually make this spill over to the entire economy and to the entire world.
Great, thank you. And Professor and Ken, I'm going to come to you shortly to talk from the perspective of cloud service providers. But Professor, you've written and spoken quite a bit on government regulation or government incentives to make cloud computing more sustainable. Can I ask you to respond to Eli's thoughts and share with us some of the benefits of government regulation or incentives to make cloud services more sustainable?
Government essentially can certainly encourage people to move to cloud services. And obviously, the users are the businesses who are having their in-house capability, in-house application, in-house infrastructure. So as you said in the beginning, when they are expensive, automatically businesses will move to cloud, and that is already happening. And traditionally, some of these business automation applications and software, especially if you look at emerging economies like India, so there was not big adoption. But with the emergence of cloud-based services, there is more and more adoption. So without the government intervention, that is happening. So that is actually a good thing. So what government can do is perhaps provide some policies and measures to encourage all these data center operators, cloud service providers to to make their infrastructure more sustainable. So that can be done through technological means, and that can also be done through using renewable energy. So from technology perspective, there are approaches and technical solutions that helps in offering cloud services at the same quality but reducing the energy consumption. That is one way of doing it. So making sustainably by reducing our energy consumption. So having latest hardware system, but just hardware is not enough. But we also need to have a software approaches in terms of how they can tune, how they can allocate resources within cloud computing environment to support this application. So there are various technical approaches that one can take in making this happen. And when you go to inside the cloud data centers, you have cooling systems, you have compute system. When you go to compute, then you have CPU, memory, networks. At each of these level, low level, they all consume a lot of energy. Especially cooling system perhaps maybe consume 40-50% of energy in the data center, the remaining by compute system and storage and compute. So how can we reduce their energy consumption from whatever it is to maybe by another 30-50%? So it is technically feasible. Of course, current solutions are not that strong enough or not that sophisticated enough to make that happen. So because right now the approaches they use are mostly trying to optimize or minimize energy consumption of one of the component. Like there are approaches to minimize energy consumption of CPU, approaches to minimize energy consumption of memory, or approaches to minimize, manage this cooling system a little better. But what we need is more integrated, holistic way of managing all the resources in a cloud data center. So there is a technical solution. So here governments can be perhaps give them incentive for reducing their energy consumption. So that way people invest in R&D in that area in that direction. That is more of energy reduction, consumption reduction. The next one is using renewable energy. And this is where, of course, they can encourage by operators to invest in perhaps production of renewable energy. I think a country like India and Asian countries, they have a very sunny place, a lot of sun energy there, so they can increase that part. Then hydro is maybe a bit saturated, but there is a huge opportunity to go towards solar energy. So this is where, and of course, all these emerging economics, they're also increasing, their energy consumption is also increasing, electric energy consumption in different sectors. Therefore, rather than investing in coal powered energy, they can invest in, this renewable more and more. So given that these cloud operators are also making a lot of money these days, like Amazon, during this Web 2.0 era, they are making a lot of business. So perhaps they can be encouraged to invest. So that energy, they can use it for their own operation, but also perhaps, feed it to the grid for other consumption. They can make money there also. Yeah, this is probably an approach that governments and the cloud service providers can get inspired and then be key players in investment so that more and more energy can be fed into the system, and not only cloud but also other areas.
Great. Thank you, Professor. Ken, you mentioned many of the things that AWS is doing to make cloud computing sustainable. And if I can, let's focus for a moment on the Asia Pacific region where you are. It's home to nearly 60% of the world's population, and sadly about 100 of the smoggiest cities. And as the professor was just noting, challenging markets for renewable energy. And so it's vital that our strategies take into account all the challenges in this particular region. And I note that AWS just had a webinar on meeting sustainability and climate goals with the cloud in APAC in the Asia Pacific region. And can you tell me a little bit more about the conclusions and the recommendations that came from out of the webinar, and what your company would like to do as a response to some of these challenges in your region?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And let me respond to some of the comments that were made just before this.
Please.
I don't know if it would hearten you to hear this or not, but I can say that for us, one of the biggest drivers for our sustainability work is our customers themselves. Many customers are moving onto the cloud, but they know they have choices. And for them, they want to make sure that their move to the cloud results in sustainable outcomes, right? They want to choose cloud providers based on the sustainability credentials of those cloud providers. And so for us, it's really important that we be providing not only the most sustainable infrastructure that we can to our customers, but also that we're providing them the tools and the means of driving more sustainable outcomes in their own businesses using cloud-enabled tools. So that's really where we're coming from. Is we're really, all the investments in our infrastructure and in beyond for the renewables projects that we're enabling. That's really being done ultimately for our customers. So I just want to plant that thought, because I think it's a really important driver for what we look to, why we're trying to accelerate innovation on our own innovation, and how we're trying to help customers accelerate innovation in their businesses as well. The event that you mentioned, the reason that we held our first AWS Sustainability Summit in the Asia Pacific region this year was really occasioned by a study that was done by 451 Research, who are part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. So there's a research outfit that's done a lot of work on cloud infrastructure and market developments. And what they did is they went and they surveyed over 500 enterprises and public sector organizations across the Asia Pacific region. And that includes over 100 enterprises and public sector organizations in India as well. And they took all of that data and were trying to understand sort of what is the sustainability value of migration to the cloud. And what they found from all of those interviews is that there's, for the average enterprise or public sector organization in the Asia Pacific region and in India, there's a nearly 80% reduction in the energy required to power workloads when you move from on-premises data centers into the cloud. And there's an associated nearly 80% reduction in the carbon footprint associated with running those IT workloads as well. And that's really significant. What we found from the study is that the reason why you see that reduction is there's a nearly 5 times increase in energy efficiency associated with moving from on-premises into the cloud. And I think my colleagues on the call today have pointed to a number of areas where energy is consumed at data centers. Cooling is one area. One of the things that was really interesting to see in this study is that there's nearly 2/3 of that energy efficiency increase that you're seeing, or actually greater than 2/3, is coming from server level efficiencies. And so, one of the areas that we've seen at Amazon AWS is that, we're trying to use our scale. So speaking of how we're using our scale to drive innovation, we have custom-built, purpose-built equipment that we're using in a lot of our data centers, from the chip level all the way up to the grid. And an example of that, we just had reInvent, which is our annual cloud computing conference held every November. We announced the Graviton3 processor. It's the most efficient EC2 processor that's out on the market today, 3.6 times more efficient than any processor that we've previously used. Thinking about those kinds of innovations from the chip, even in our rack design, what we've done in our data centers is we are stripping out the uninterruptible power supply and instead replacing that with individual rack level battery packs. And fine-tuning the energy use at a rack level. And what we find is that has the effect of reducing power conversion loss that we saw previously from a large uninterruptible power supply design previously. And so literally everything that we're doing, from the chip level, from the server level, all the way up to the facility level, we're seeing that have an impact in terms of the power reduction that's achieved from moving from on-premises into the cloud. And just one last point on this that also I think came from the study that was really interesting to see. So Ellie was talking about standards. One of the things that we haven't seen as much in terms of energy efficiency standards is our workload-based standards. What we've seen from the survey that was done by 451 Research is that for the average enterprise or public sector organization, you tend to see utilization rates of about 15%. For cloud providers like ourselves, the average utilization rate starts at 50%, but goes well high of that. We run in the 80s and 90s in some cases. And that really is because we're able to use our role as a cloud provider to allocate workloads efficiently across our customer base. And so there's a lot of still room for efficiencies, not just on the hardware itself, but even in thinking about how we use virtualized servers and how we think about increasing utilization rates. And again, trying to maximize energy efficiency where we can first. And we were pretty thrilled to see how that was turns out in the study. The last thing that we had at this conference that you mentioned was a look at customers. I think what is humbling to see is that for most of our customers, their energy use associated with running their workloads overall is a relatively small part of their total carbon footprint. And what many of our customers are looking to us for is ways that they can drive deeper decarbonization, deeper sustainability across more of their business beyond just how they're running their IT workloads. And so that's why we've been trying to start this annual conference to highlight tools and use cases that our customers are focusing on in terms of driving deeper decarbonization opportunities across their businesses and across infrastructure around the world.
You raise a very interesting challenge, Ken. There have been so many improvements in the efficiency of servers and the way they're organized for energy efficiency, but the increases not only in the technologies available to make cloud computing more sustainable, but then also just migrating from on-premises servers to cloud service providers. It's generating quite a bit of waste, of obsolete systems, and there's a real need for recycling, responsible recycling plans for all of that waste. Can you talk a little bit about what AWS does in that regard? And I know it's outside of your bailiwick, but do you think this is a substantial, significant problem? Do you think that the cloud service providers are doing enough to help with all of the waste issues?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I can't speak to what others are doing, but I can describe a little bit of what we do as Amazon AWS. And much like we're doing with energy, right? So the first thing we're always looking at when we're thinking about energy use is where can we reduce waste to begin with, increase energy efficiency. We take the same approach with electronic equipment. When we've used equipment to the extent that we can, rather than having that turn into e-waste or recycle it directly, we're always first looking for opportunities to reuse, repair, and ultimately reuse that equipment in other capacities. So that's always going to be a priority for us. We have a network of experienced vendors that manage our used equipment, and they're following local, national, and regional requirements for disposal and recycling if it comes to that. I think this is something that we would like to see greater discussion of across the industry. I think our vendors are providing data on a full management cycle of our used equipment. We're able to verify reuse, recycling, and ensuring that our waste is responsibly managed to the final endpoint when we are ultimately looking at the end of that life cycle. But I do think that as an industry, we should be thinking about ways that we can be reusing equipment rather than relegating it to waste in the first place. And that's, I think, a growing area of discussion. One that, like you mentioned earlier, we need to be thinking not just about energy use, but water use as well. And I'm happy to talk more about water sustainability as an industry topic as well.
Yes, I want to come back to you on water sustainability. It's something that we don't talk about enough. But let me quickly turn to Ellie and ask you, focusing on the environmental impacts. Environmentalists have estimated that by 2025, the technology sector could consume 20% of the world's total electricity. And this would be an increase from approximately 7% today. And so this is a huge increase in the amount of consumption of energy. And then on top of that, we have some of the challenges that I was just discussing with Ken on e-waste. And I'll ask you to talk about water as well, if you will. With all of these environmental challenges, what are some of the ideas that you've come across that you find most compelling for reducing the environmental impact of cloud computing?
To be perfectly honest, I think that we should have more leverage over the hyperscalers, which we don't. I think that Ken has already alluded to the fact that some of their initiatives in this direction comes from customer expectations. But to be perfectly honest, customers currently have remarkably little leverage over the major cloud providers. They can voice expectations and desires, but at the end of the day, the big, resourceful, rich, ever-present that bundle their services are the hyperscalers. And the problem we have is Ken formulated a goal of providing a stable outcome. The outcome is not stable on cost expenditure on the cloud. All the data suggests that it's not stable, and that in fact you overspend on it, and some on-prem use is actually more efficient, and so on. We don't get stable outcome on robustness. Look at the outages of AWS recently and their implications. So what happens is, yes, many of these initiatives that Ken and others are promoting are commendable. I don't wish to belittle them. They do have an impact. But at the end of the day, if we can't improve our leverage over these cloud providers by subjecting them to objective standards across all of these boards, across all of the issues, and the only way to do it is to require of them interoperability and portability, just as we have done with mobile phones. We have to be able to switch between providers based on the cost proposition, based on the environmental standards that they uphold, based on their level of transparency, based on the stable outcome that they provide on robustness and resiliency. That, unfortunately, is not yet the case. So what we should build upon are the identification of all this knowledge that Ken has highlighted based on his surveys. We should build on all the initiatives that are going forward, all of which are commendable. But we need to take it to a very much higher level, precisely because of the statistics you quoted, Jennifer.
How do we get that leverage, Ellie?
I think by setting up objective standards, number one, and by, I think that sort of really pushing the industry to come up with interoperability standards. And if it won't come up by itself, we would have to contemplate some regulation.
Professor, I'm going to turn to you in a moment, but Ken, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that with your thoughts.
So I have to say on the standards point, one of the challenges I think that you mentioned, Ellie, were keeping up with advancements and having regulation that can provide sort of a leading incentive for sustainability. I'll talk about sustainability because that's where my focus in my work. One of the challenges that we've seen is that there are, different markets have different standards, can create in some cases, how do we create best practice? I think really we need to be looking at the most advanced practices, and sometimes regulation can arrive too late to promote that. An example in the European Union that I can point to, there's been a big effort by the data center industry, also industry groups, as well as working with regulators to establish a climate neutral data center standard. Now, that was a voluntary effort that the industry came together to promote. It's got very high standards, very ambitious standards, and all of the industry has really fallen into line around that. I think that is a good example of how trying to take not just sort of what's the standard today, but thinking going forward about how we can be more ambitious towards renewable energy goals, towards decarbonizing operations, and creating a common platform for tracking, monitoring, and verifying progress towards those goals. That's an example in the data center industry. I mentioned previously the climate pledge is a similar effort to be ambitious in decarbonizing our operations well before many of the world's governments have pledged to do by 2050 under the climate pledge or under the Paris Agreement. We do this again because our customers increasingly expect it of us. I think our customers actually are quite sophisticated. They do understand what they want from us, and they're increasingly making requests of us. That point that I was talking about with how we're using our scale to try and change markets, not just with renewable energy. I mean, with our renewable energy projects, we've set the standard of not only meeting 100% renewable energy, but we are pledging to purchase renewable power above and beyond what's available on the grid today. So we're trying to make sure that our investments go towards creating markets for more availability and affordability of renewable energy for everyone, including our customers in those markets. We see the same thing in our data center construction. One thing that hasn't really been looked at is embodied carbon. Data centers don't use a huge amount of concrete or steel, but we believe, as Amazon, that we need to be driving better outcomes in markets for steel and concrete, which is why one of the first things that we've done in all of our new data center builds is we're using carbon cure concrete. There's a company called Carbon Cure, which was one of the first recipients of the Climate Pledge Fund. This is a company that we invested in as Amazon. But they found a way of capturing the carbon emissions that are coming from the concrete manufacturing process and injecting that back into the concrete itself. And so you're essentially using carbon neutral concrete in the foundations of our data centers when we're using carbon cure concrete. So finding ways to really use our purchasing power to use the expectations that our customers have such that we're increasingly moving towards greater sustainability in our infrastructure, as well as in the tools that we offer to our customers. That is really having an impact. And I just want to make that clear, that the message is loud and clear. We need to be doing more as an industry, and we're doing that through groups like the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact. We also need to be doing more as individual providers and using our scale to make positive market changes, more sustainable outcomes. We're certainly doing that on the energy front, as I mentioned, in embodied carbon, and happy to talk more about water as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to questions from our audience for the panelists. And Professor, an audience member has asked, as more people come online in Asia Pacific due to cheaper cost of smartphones and data, does it make sense to have more cloud data centers in this part of the world? Building a data center is not cheap, so would the cost be justifiable? And Professor, you're on mute.
Yes, I agree that given that more and more mobile devices are penetrated in emerging economies like India, very everywhere, rapid growth. So obviously they need to access to services which are hosted in cloud. The question is where those cloud data centers will be located. Should they be in the United States or should they be in India, for instance? So there are clear benefits. So setting up, say for example, within India can be, also additional cost. But having said that, when we need to provide services that are with low latency, quick response time, so rather than having data center located somewhere far away, you can have edge data center, what it's called. So this is gaining popularity, and also new workload and new applications you mentioned that in 5 years' time, it will increase by 20% of energy will be consumed by cloud data centers. And then if all the data that is generated by like what we call Internet of Things that integrate physical world, digital world, to create, for example, a smart city, smart transport system, or smart healthcare. So these devices constantly generate data. And if you keep pushing the data through internet to all the way to data center somewhere in the United States, so the latency will be high. Internet also will get clogged with so much of load. So therefore, it actually makes sense to have edge data centers. In fact, I see and I hear, of course, many companies are doing that they're trying to establish the data center in the Asian countries as well. So even AWS, initially they had primarily in Seattle. After that, they started spreading data center everywhere, and they established here in Australia also, and also in India. Especially in Singapore, I hear that they have one. So why is that? So that is one is to cater to the needs of local customers. And second, you mentioned about this privacy regulatory concerns. Sometimes these governments have concerns about healthcare data not go out of the boundary of a country, in which case you can put that here in the local place. Or banking application. So some of the data maybe there will be mandated from regulatory like RBI, Reserve Bank of India, RBI in India. So they might say, oh, this bank data cannot go to outside the boundary of India. In which case we need the local data center. So these are the reasons why they get created. Plus providing services to, like if you are a application service provider, cloud application service provider, and you have that capability in say in India, then if there is a demand in other places for the same service, then we should be able to make multi-cloud computing, like move these application components across multiple data center, so that customers from different places can be served from the nearest data center and best service, best quality. So there are many reasons to create it, apart from the cost. The latency, quality services, then the IoT new class of workloads. And by 2030, we'll see this IoT-based workload and AI workload will be much more dominant than what we have today. So definitely this establishing new data centers in India or in emerging economies is a need, and that will happen.
Thank you, Professor. One thing that strikes me in thinking about data centers in India, and Ken, I'll turn to you for this, is the cooling of the centers. And so traditionally, data centers have been located in colder climates, but there have been new innovations in cooling, including, if I'm not mistaken, Microsoft has an underwater data center now. So Ken, can you talk to us about water usage for cooling and what your company has found are some of the sustainable and best ways of keeping data centers cool?
Yeah, thanks. So yes, you're right that it makes sense to try and cool using outside cooler air where you can. And we do in fact do that in many parts of the world. Use outside air for cooling for much of the year. And then for the hottest days when we do need to use water for cooling, we've optimized our systems to use minimal water. Obviously this is a challenge in more temperate regions or in tropical regions rather, where the temperature doesn't vary much throughout the year. We still are, one of the first things, again, as I've mentioned before, is always trying to identify opportunities to reduce waste, increase efficiency. And so, we will use real-time sensor data to adapt to changing weather conditions where we can. With water itself, I guess the first thing to highlight is that we are constantly working with local utilities to expand access to reclaimed or recycled water instead of using potable drinking water in the first place. And this is actually a pretty significant challenge. There's in some parts of the world, there's a ready market for what's called gray water or treated water that can be used for industrial purposes, but it's not potable drinking water. That's one thing that we could look at on a global basis, is thinking about how to create opportunities to access that reclaimed water in the first place. For ourselves, what we do then from there is we've maximized the number of times we've installed innovative technology for on-site water treatment that we are using to remove scale-forming minerals. And so you can cycle the water through our cooling systems, many times, but ultimately there's a buildup of minerals over time that prevents you from being able to do that indefinitely. And so what we've done as a third step, first, reducing the water that we need to use, potable water in the first place, recycling that as many times as we can. We also are working in some markets to find uses for that water that we recycled as many times as we can. And so an innovative example of this in the western part of the US that we recently launched is we're working with local farmers to provide that as a water that we've recycled as many times as we can for irrigation purposes for local farming. But we think there's applications for other industrial use as well. And we're looking at solutions like this in every market in which we're working around the world.
Great, thank you. We only have, sadly, a few minutes left. I'm going to turn to Ellie, if I may. You've written and spoken quite a bit about all the balancing that we need to do. Do you think we're getting it mostly right now in terms of maximizing the benefits of the cloud and minimizing the harm? It sounds like we have a lot more work to do in minimizing the harm. And if I may, in your last few minutes, can you talk just a little bit about, you've used the term hyperscalers, and we've seen often larger corporations buying up smaller competitors. Can you just give us any last thoughts on how that will potentially harm innovation, and how having competitors in the field is a positive thing, assuming you agree with that?
Well, thanks for the question, Jennifer. So I mean, a lot of it depends on whether you're looking at the glass as being half empty or half full. I think what we've heard from my two other distinguished colleagues is that there are some important initiatives underway. I think on the whole, those pale in comparison to where we need to be, and in light of the intensity of the digital transformation and the challenges it brings up. And because of our difficulty of directing it from above through regulation and legislation, and because some of that may cause not just fragmentation, but the local standards that, for example, Ken has been repeatedly talked about, are so very different between India, say, and Europe, right, on water usage or other types of requirements. So what happens is meeting local requirements isn't good enough. The question is, are there global standards that you should meet regardless where your operation takes place? And those do not exist at the moment. So we shouldn't leave it exclusively at the discretion of individual entities to come up with some of their self-imposed standards. Some of them, once they have come up by themselves, are commendable, and we shouldn't disregard those. But just as they have said, their market power, their cloud, their sophistication, their presence, and so on is so significant that they can actually drive the change not only for themselves, but also for the others. And in some ways, bring the governments along as well as others. So I think we have ways and ways to go in dealing with the governance challenges across the board. We're focused here this morning on the sustainability and so on. We hardly dealt with the inclusion aspects, which I think are quite profound in and of themselves. Particularly, how do we deal with less privileged communities? How do we deal with, there was the question of the data centers, right? How do we deal with the people who are more physically handicapped? How we deal with the elderly and so on? Lots of very difficult issues that have to do with the fact the need to address the growing latency challenges as some of the applications require, also have to cause us to think of what can be done by the hyperscalers using the current model, or what different model needs to be put in place to try and accommodate. So I would say there is a growing awareness, which is good. There are many initiatives underway, which is important. There is a growing recognition of the hyperscalers, in particular, of the role they have to play. This is also commendable, but we have light years to cover in a very short period of time if we want to make the digital transformation sustainable from every possible direction, from stability of performance to environmental friendliness.
Great. Thank you so much, Eli. just this very short conversation has focused very much on the environmental aspects of cloud computing, and as Eli rightly notes, we could do 2 or 3 more panels on the human rights issues, on government surveillance issues, on any of the other challenges. But in particular, Ken, I want to thank you for coming and sharing with us the industry perspective and all the work that you're doing. The trusted principles are incredibly important and show a lot of initiative on the part of the industry to lead in its own right on this issue. And there's no doubt that the cloud offers extraordinary opportunities for our computing power, and the leaps and bounds in the technological advancements are staggering. So I look forward to seeing how we continue to balance all the promise of the cloud with many of the important challenges that we've talked about today. And I want to thank our panelists. Your expertise is very helpful to all of us in understanding how we can make cloud computing more sustainable as we move forward into the future. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to Carnegie India for this wonderful panel.